Religions of the world, Native American religions. All right, so today we're diving into one of the oldest and honestly most misunderstood religious traditions out there, Native American religions. And right off the bat, let's clear something up. This is not one single religion. I know, shocking. But seriously, when people say Native American religion like it's one neat, organized system, that's already the first mistake. We're talking about a people whose histories in North America go back somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years. And while science generally supports migration into the Americas, it's important to note that many Native traditions hold that they originated right here. So even the origin story isn't one size fits all. Now, add that to the fact that there have been up to 2,000 distinct cultures across North America alone. Different climates, different lifestyles, different everything. Some groups were hunter-gatherers, some were farmers, some lived nomadically, and others built full-on cities and complex societies. So yeah, trying to lump all of that into one religion is like calling everything from Catholicism to Buddhism the same thing. It just doesn't work. And yet, a lot of people still picture Native Americans as plains tribes chasing bison on horseback. That image, that's actually pretty late historically and heavily influenced by European contact. Horses and guns weren't originally part of those cultures. Many of those same groups had agricultural roots before shifting lifestyles. So already we've got diversity layered on top of diversity. Now, here's where things get tricky for historians and honestly kind of frustrating. Native American religious traditions are incredibly old, but written records, we only really had those in the region for the last 400 years. And most of those were written by European explorers and Christian missionaries who were, let's just say, not always neutral observers. So when scholars study these religions, there's always this question: are we looking at original traditions or traditions that have been influenced, sometimes heavily, by contact with Europeans and Christianity? And the answer is both. Native religions didn't just disappear, many adapted. They absorbed outside elements while still holding on to core beliefs. And even though they've changed over time, like literally every religion ever, it's still completely valid to talk about Native American religions as living traditions today. Now, if we go even further back, before European contact, our main source is archaeology, and archaeology is great for telling us how people lived, but not always what they believed, especially when you're dealing with cultures that didn't leave behind big stone temples or written texts explaining their theology. So we're kind of piecing together things from fragments, which means there are limits to what we can actually know. Because of all of this, there are really two ways to approach Native American religions. One is zoom in, study one tribe, one place, one moment in time. The other is to zoom out, look for broader patterns across many cultures. For this episode, we're going to go with the big picture view, because trying to cover every individual tradition would take, several lifetimes and a very strong coffee habit. So think of this as your foundation. We're not talking about one religion, we're talking about a whole world of belief systems shaped by thousands of years of history, environment, and culture. The spirit world. Okay, so now that we've established Native American religions are not one neat little system, let's ask the obvious question people always want answered. Are they polytheistic, monotheistic, something else entirely? And the answer is yes, all of the above. Seriously, though, trying to force Native American religions into the same categories we use for, say, Christianity or Islam doesn't actually work out. You see, in many traditions, nature itself is alive. Not metaphorically, literally alive with spirit. We're talking spirits in animals, spirits in plants, spirits in weather, spirits in visions and dreams. So basically everything. Thunder, that's not just weather, that's a being. Lightning, also a being. The world just isn't inhabited by spirit, it is spirit. At the center of all this, you often find something like Mother Earth, and not just as a poetic idea, but as a real life-giving force. Nature isn't background scenery. It's alive, active, powerful, personal. In that sense, these traditions can look polytheistic because there are so many spirits, many powers, and many forces at work. But many traditions also recognize a single supreme being, a high god, or godhead, a great spirit. Sounds monotheistic, right? Except this high god is often not super involved in your day-to-day life. It is kind of above it all, distant, not in a cold way, just not in a micromanaging your daily problems. So, who do people actually interact with? The spirits, nature spirits, ancestors, the ones connected to everyday life. Those are the ones you would pray to, the ones you would ask for help, the ones who actually handle things on the ground, literally. And then it gets even more layered. Because for some, this great spirit isn't even a person at all. It's more like a force, a kind of sacred energy that exists in everything. A really good example of this is the Lakota concept of Wakantanka, often translated as the Great Mystery. And I love this idea because it's not just a god sitting somewhere. It's a power that flows through everything. People, animals, nature, the spirit world. If something has influence or meaning in life, it's connected to this force. So instead of asking, is this religion polytheistic or monotheistic, a better question might be, why are we trying to box it in at all? Native American religions can be polytheistic, many spirits, monotheistic, a great spirit, and even monistic. Everything is part of one sacred reality, all at the same time, which honestly makes them way more flexible and way more interesting. Animism. All right, let's now talk about animism. And before the word scares anyone off, it's actually pretty straightforward. Animism is the idea that the world is spiritually alive. Not just people, not just gods, but everything. Trees, rivers, animals, rocks, even landscapes. So when I said earlier that Native American religions see the world as full of spirit, this is exactly what I meant. Now, you'll often hear people describe Native Americans as having a deep respect for nature, which is true, but this also kind of undersells it. It's not just respect, it's relationship. The land isn't just land, it's something you live with, depend on, and honestly owe something to. And part of that comes from a very practical reality: survival. For most Native American cultures, survival depended on living in balance with the environment, not controlling or reshaping it. So instead of asking, how can we use this land, the mindset was more like, how do we live with it without messing it up? Now, scholars use the term animism to describe this, but here's the key idea. An animist believes that things in nature have spirit and power, not just a symbolic meaning, but real influence. Spirits can help or they can harm, which means you don't just take from nature, you interact with it carefully. You show respect, you make offerings, you follow certain practices. because you're not dealing with objects, you're dealing with other beings. And this becomes really clear when we look at something like hunting. Hunting wasn't just about getting food, it was also a religious act. The animal wasn't seen as less than human. It was seen as a fellow creature with its own spirit. So before a hunter might pray to the spirit of the animal. After the hunt, there might be an acknowledgement or even an apology, and nothing was wasted. Every part of the animal was used because taking a life wasn't casual, it was something that required respect and responsibility. Now, compare that to what happened later with large-scale commercial hunting, like mass killing of bison, and you start to see why these worldviews clashed so hard. And it's not just animals. Agriculture, gathering materials, even cutting wood, these could all have religious meaning. Plants were understood to have spirit. The earth itself, as in Mother Earth, was something to be cared for, not dominated. There are even accounts of people making an offering before cutting down a tree, which, if you think about it, is a very different mindset than clear the land and build. Now, to be fair, not every Native American group lived perfectly in harmony with nature all the time. There were cases where environments were strained or damaged. And on the flip side, not every European saw nature as something to exploit. So we don't want to turn this into a simple one group good, one group bad situation. But overall, there was a real difference in worldview. And you can actually hear the difference in a quote from a Wintu perspective, which basically says, when Native people use the land, they take what they need and try not to harm it. But when Europeans came, they dug deeper, cut more, destroyed more, and didn't really listen to what the land was saying. It's a powerful way of expressing that clash, not just of cultures, but of how people understood their place in the world. And interestingly, today, as more people start worrying about environmental issues, there's been a growing interest in Native American spirituality because that idea of living in balance with nature suddenly feels a lot more relevant. Contacts with the spirit world. All right, so now that we talked about a world full of spirits, what do people do with that? Like, how do you actually live in a world where everything has spirit? And this is where Native American religions start to look different and unique. Because in Abrahamic religions, the focus is on one supreme God and your relationship with that one being. But in many Native American traditions, the focus is much more local, much more day to day. Instead of concentrating all attention on one distant high God, people are primarily concerned with their relationship with the many spirits that exist in the world around them. The spirits of the land, the spirits of the forest, the spirits of the rivers, the spirits of the animals they depend on. Basically, the world they actually interact with every single day. And this shapes what religious life looks like. Because rituals aren't really about controlling nature or bending it to your will. They're about something much more practical and honestly, more relational. They're about communication, maintaining good relationships, staying in balance. So instead of asking, how do we control the world? The question becomes, how do we live well with everything in it? And that includes the spiritual side of things, rituals, prayers, offerings. These are all ways of building and maintaining relationships with spiritual beings, not commanding them, not dominating them, but interacting with them in a way that keeps things stable, respectful, balanced. And when you think about it, That fits perfectly with everything we've talked about so far. If the world is alive with spirit, then religion isn't just about belief. It's about how you relate to the world around you, seen and unseen. Sacrifice. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, this is not unique to Native American religions. Pretty much every religion in history has done this in some form. Animals, food, drink, and yes, sometimes even humans. So the idea itself isn't extraordinary. At its core, sacrifice is about giving something of value to the spiritual world, usually in exchange for help, protection, or survival. Now, in Native American traditions, especially in what is now the United States and Canada, large-scale sacrifices, especially human sacrifice, was rare. That kind of thing was more common in parts of Central and South America, but sacrifice still existed. It just looked different. Often, it wasn't about offering someone else, it was about offering something of yourself. A really good example of this is the sun dance, practiced by several Plains tribes. The sun dance was a major religious ceremony focused on renewal, both for the individual and for the community. It usually involved several days of fasting, dancing, and prayer. And in some cases, participants would undergo physical sacrifice, like having small wooden pegs inserted into the skin of their chest, which were then attached to a central pole. As they danced, they would pull against those pegs until the skin tore free. I know, that sounds intense, because it is. But the purpose wasn't punishment or suffering. It was about commitment, endurance, and spiritual connection. A way of offering personal sacrifice in exchange for strength, healing, or the well-being of the community. There were also objects like medicine bundles made from animal parts, plants, and minerals. These weren't random collections. They were believed to carry real spiritual power, and they were valued and passed down over generations. And here's an important distinction. While sacrifice and spiritual power were important, the kind of large-scale blood sacrifice seen in some other religions was generally not a central part of the Native American worship. In fact, the idea of simply spilling blood as an offering could even be seen as, well, wasteful, or worse, disrespectful to both the spirit world and the life being taken. So again, sacrifice here isn't really about destruction. It's about exchange, respect, and maintaining balance with the spiritual world. Taboo. Now, at a basic level, a taboo is just something you're not supposed to do. But in Native American religions, taboos are not random rules. They're a way of protecting oneself from possible danger coming from the spirit world. Because again, the spirit world isn't distant. It overlaps with everyday life. So certain actions, objects, or even people can fall outside what's considered normal and become spiritually dangerous or powerful. Taboos are basically a way of saying, don't do this unless you want to deal with the consequences from the spirit world. Now, some of these taboos are tied to specific people or situations. One example that shows up in a lot of cultures has to do with menstruating women. In many Native American traditions, especially in societies that depend heavily on hunting, women during this time were believed to have unusual spiritual power. Not necessarily negative power, but powerful enough to affect things around them. Because of that, they were sometimes set apart from the rest of the community. In some cases, a woman might leave her household or stay in a separate place for a period of time. Why? because it was believed that her presence, or even something as simple as her gaze, could interfere with things like hunting. There were beliefs that this power could weaken or destroy a hunter's ability, interfere with the spiritual power of hunting weapons, or even drive animals away from the area entirely. So don't mess with PMSing women or risk getting cursed at. We get it. Actually, joking aside, one of the most widely observed and honestly most serious taboos has to do with something else: the dead. Across many Native American traditions, there is a strong belief that after death, a person's spirit may remain close to the world of the living. Across many Native American traditions, there is a strong belief that after death, a person's spirit may remain close to the world of the living. And not just in a peaceful, distant way, but potentially in a way that could affect people. The concern is that a spirit might linger near its former home, or even attempt to take friends or family with it. At the very least, it might cause disturbances like bad dreams or illness. Because of this, the dead are treated with a mix of deep respect and real caution. In some traditions, people avoid touching dead bodies entirely. Even the clothing, belongings, or homes of the dead may be feared or avoided. In some cases, people are reluctant to even handle victims of accidents unless absolutely necessary. Burial practices also reflect this concern. There is often a strong effort to make sure the body stays in its grave and does not return to the world of the living. Sometimes, the names of the dead are not spoken for years after death. And in certain communities, the people who handled the bodies, like preparing it for burial, were considered ritually unclean for a period of time. They might be separated from the community, restricted in what they could eat, and required to go through a period of purification before returning to normal life. And burial grounds themselves, they're considered both sacred and dangerous places that should not be disturbed under any circumstances. And this belief hasn't disappeared. In fact, it's one of the reasons there have been serious conflicts between Native American communities and archaeologists. Because while scientists often study human remains to learn about the past, many Native Americans see that as a deep violation. Not just disrespectful, but spiritually dangerous. So when we talk about taboos, we're not just talking about rules. We're talking about a system designed to help people navigate a world where the spiritual and physical are constantly overlapping, where certain actions matter, when certain moments carry power, and when certain boundaries should not be crossed. Ceremonies and rituals. So now I will explain what people actually do in these religions. Now, ceremonies are extremely important in Native American religions. They're not just about worship in the traditional sense. They're really about maintaining and renewing the relationships between humans and the spirit world. And these ceremonies can involve all kinds of things: dancing, singing, fasting, bathing, even physical ordeals, along with following certain taboos. It's not something passive. Now, one of the most important elements in many of these ceremonies is dance. And this isn't just for performance. Dance is actually a way of contacting the spirit world. Entire communities might take part, especially during important moments like preparing for a hunt, the agricultural season, or major life events. And these dances aren't quiet or subtle. They're accompanied by drums, rattles, flutes, and songs that are often repeated over and over again. Sometimes the rhythm is simple, other times it's more complex. But either way, after hours of repetition, the effect can be almost hypnotic, putting participants in a state where they feel closer to the spirit world. Now, this becomes especially important in cultures that depend on hunting because hunting is unpredictable. One season, there could be plenty of game. The next season, nothing. No animals. An epic hunting failure. So, the question becomes, what changed? From a Native American perspective, the answer often involved the spiritual world. So before a hunt, rituals were performed to prepare not just the hunters, but also their weapons and even the spirits of the animals themselves. Everything had to be in the right balance to ensure success, and some of these rituals could get very symbolic. For example, there are accounts of Pueblo ceremonies where people would actually act out the hunt. The men would move on all fours, wearing deer skins, or carry staffs to mimic animal legs. Children might imitate young animals like fawns, moving around them. It wasn't just a performance, it was meant to bring the spirit of the animals into the ceremony. At the center of this, there might be a figure, like the mother of game, a symbolic figure connected to the animals, sometimes also associated with Earth Mother. She would lead the animals, essentially presenting them as offerings for the hunt. Now, this kind of ritual is often described as sympathetic or imitative magic. Basically, the idea is this: if you symbolically act something out, like a successful hunt, it helps bring about the same result in real life. So, by calling forth the animals in a ceremony, you're helping ensure they'll appear in the actual hunt. And even after the hunt, the relationship doesn't end because animals weren't seen as just resources. They were seen as spiritually connected beings. So hunters might apologize to the animal before killing it, and afterward, the body would be treated with respect, sometimes almost like an honored guest. So again, ceremonies aren't just rituals for the sake of tradition. They're about communication, preparation, and maintaining balance between humans and the spirit world. The Vision Quest. The goal of Vision Quest were to gain spiritual power or guidance by coming into direct contact with the spirit world. And these visions are especially important for young people at puberty, basically as a kind of rite of passage into adulthood. At some point, a young person would be sent out alone into the wilderness. No friends, no family, just them. And they would stay out there, sometimes for several days, fasting, which means no food, sometimes no water, and only the bare minimum clothing or possessions. So, yeah, this is not a casual camping trip. The idea was to strip everything away and make the person appear humble or vulnerable before the spirits. And eventually, if everything went as hoped, they would receive a vision. Now, these visions didn't usually look like a clear, logical message. They often came in a kind of dreamlike or trance-like state. And very often, the spirits would appear in the form of animals. When that happened, that animal could become a kind of spiritual guardian for the person, a lifelong connection. Sometimes the person's name would even change to reflect that relationship. The idea is often referred to as totemism, where a person has a special spiritual bond with a particular animal, and that connection stays with them for life. Now, not everyone gets a vision right away, and if it didn't come after a few days, some individuals might take more extreme measures to show sincerity, things like self-inflicted pain. Again, not for punishment, but as a demonstration of commitment. And when the vision finally did come, that person will return to their community as a full member of the group, having completed an important rite of passage. But vision quests weren't just for teenagers. Adults also sought visions at important moments in life, before battles, during major hunts, or when facing big decisions or crises. So this wasn't a one-time thing. It was a way of seeking guidance and direction throughout life. Now, while vision quests are often individual, there are also communal ways people prepared themselves for these kinds of spiritual experiences. One really important example is the sweat lodge ceremony. Think of it as a very intense, very spiritual sauna. Participants would enter a small, enclosed, dome-shaped structure while heated stones were brought inside. Water would be poured over the stones, filling the space with thick steam and heat. And this wasn't about relaxing. It was about purification. People would pray, sing, and reflect inside the lodge, using the heat to cleanse both the body and the mind. The idea was to remove physical and spiritual impurities, making a person more ready to receive visions and communicate with the spirit world. And just like the vision quest, it wasn't easy. It was uncomfortable, intense, sometimes overwhelming, but that discomfort was part of the process. It helped push people into a different mental and spiritual state, one where they were more open, more focused, and more connected. So whether someone was alone in the wilderness or sitting in a dark, steaming lodge, the goal was the same: to seek connection with the spirit world and find meaning, guidance, and purpose within it. Religious leadership. All right, now let's talk about the people who actually handled all this spiritual business: healers and religious leaders. But here's where things get interesting, because Native American religions don't really have what we'd think of as a traditional priesthood. There was no big hierarchy, no official, "you're the only one to talk to spirits" kind of situation. Instead, spiritual life is actually pretty personal. Everyone in the community can pray, participate in rituals, seek visions, and connect with the spirit world on their own. So religion isn't something done for you, it's something you actively take part in. Now, that said, there are people with special roles. The most well-known are what we often call medicine men or medicine women. And that term medicine doesn't just mean physical healing. It really means spiritual power. There are individuals who are believed to have a stronger or more direct connection to the spirit world. And just like others, they often gain that power through visions. Spirits might appear to them, sometimes after fasting and prayer, sometimes unexpectedly, and often in the form of animals like bears or badgers, which are associated with healing. Now, important detail: these spirits don't possess the healer. They don't take over their body. Instead, they teach them. They might give instructions, songs, or even specific taboos to follow. So the healer becomes someone who has been basically trained by the spirit world. And because of that connection, healers are believed to have power to heal illness, but also cause harm or sickness if angered. So yeah, not someone you want to get on the bad side of. And with that power comes serious responsibility. If a healer can't cure someone, they might say the illness comes from a stronger spiritual force. But if multiple patients start dying, the healer could actually be held responsible, and in some cases, even executed. So this was not a low-pressure job. Now, let's talk about how healing actually works. In some traditions, illness is believed to be caused by a kind of foreign object or spirit entering the body. So the healer's job is to remove it. This would often be done alongside songs, chanting, or ritual movements. And in other cases, healing could involve herbs, teas, and natural remedies. So it's not one single method. It's a combination of spiritual and physical practices. And stepping back for a second, what's really interesting here is that even though there are specialists like healers, the overall system is still very community-centered an individual. You don't need a priest to access the spirit world. You can do that yourself. The healer is just someone with more experience, more connection, and honestly, a lot more pressure. Other means of contact with the spirit world. Let's start with peyote. Peyote is a small cactus. Doesn't look like much, but it contains a substance called mescaline, which can produce very powerful visions. And because of that, it's been used in religious ceremonies for centuries, especially in parts of Mexico, and later spread to tribes in North America. Now, these weren't casual experiences. We're talking about intense, sometimes 24-hour-long visions, the kind that people believed allowed them to directly experience the spirit world. So naturally, peyote became an important part of certain ceremonies, especially for people seeking knowledge, healing, or spiritual insight. Now, here's where history steps in. After Native Americans were pushed onto reservations and went through massive upheaval in the late 1800s, many began turning to peyote ceremonies more frequently. Why? Because when everything else is unstable, people look for meaning, guidance, and connection. Over time, this led to the formation of something called the Native American Church. This is really interesting because it blends elements of traditional Native beliefs with Christianity. So you might see references to Jesus alongside peyote rituals, all within the same religious framework. And people within the church don't all believe the exact same thing. Some lean more traditional, others more Christian, and most fall somewhere in between. But there's a kind of unspoken rule. You don't criticize how someone else connects with the spiritual world. Now, not everyone outside the communities was on board with this. Peyote has been the center of legal battles in the United States for a long time. In the early 1900s, it was banned in many places because it was labeled a narcotic. And in 1990, the U.S. Supreme Court actually upheld laws banning its use, even in religious ceremonies. On top of that, Mexico restricted its export because the cactus itself became endangered. But this turned into a much bigger issue about religious freedom. Many Native Americans argued, and still argue, that restricting peyote use is basically restricting their right to practice their religion. So yeah, this isn't just about a plant. It's about identity, tradition, and rights. By the way, currently, federal law explicitly protects the use of peyote for religious ceremonies by members of federally recognized Native American tribes, especially within the Native American Church. This includes possession, use, and transport for these ceremonial purposes. Another really important means of connecting with the spirit world is tobacco. Traditionally, tobacco was used specifically for religious purposes, and it was often smoked in a sacred pipe, and the smoke was seen as a way to carry prayers to the spirit world. Think of it like incense, but stronger, more intentional, and it was used during important moments, peace talks, hunting preparations, healing ceremonies. The type of tobacco used, called Nicotiana rustica, is way stronger than modern tobacco. Like, way stronger. So strong, in fact, that just a few puffs could be overwhelming, which is part of why it was reserved for specific, meaningful ceremonies, not everyday use. And then there's healing again. Because all of this ties together. Healers didn't just rely on visions or rituals. They also used plants and herbs, some of which we now know actually had real medicinal value. So while some of the spiritual aspects might be debated today, the practical side was often surprisingly effective. And honestly, compared to some early Western medical practices like bleeding patients or giving them mercury, native healing methods were sometimes a lot less dangerous, which is kind of wild to think about. So whether it's peyote bringing visions, tobacco carrying prayers, or rituals connecting people to the spirit world, the common thread is this: these practices weren't random. They were all ways of communicating, healing, and maintaining balance between humans and something bigger than themselves. Life after death. All right, so now we're stepping into one of the biggest questions every culture tries to answer. What happens after we die? And right off the bat, we need to be careful here because there isn't just one Native American belief system. We're talking about many different tribes, cultures, and traditions, all with their own ideas. On top of that, Native American communities have been interacting with Christianity for over 400 years, so some beliefs have blended or changed over time. So instead of one clear answer, what we really have are general patterns. But here's something really interesting. Native Americans often had a strong fear of the dead, but not necessarily a strong fear of death itself. Let me explain that. Death, not always terrifying. The dead, that's another story. There was real concern that spirits of the dead might linger, return, or even cause trouble with the living. So a lot of taboos and rituals focused on handling the dead carefully. At the same time, observers have often noted that many Native Americans showed a surprising level of calmness when facing death itself. So it's less fear of dying and more, let's make sure the dead don't come back and ruin everyone's week. Now, in many traditions, there's also the idea of two souls. The first is the life soul, basically your breath, your life force, the one that stays with the body and dies when the body dies. The second is what's often called a free soul, and this one is more interesting. It can wander during dreams, leave the body during illness, and after death, continue on. This free soul travels to what's often called the land of the dead. Now, what is that exactly? Well, it depends. Sometimes it's described as a peaceful place, sometimes not so much. But often, it's seen as a kind of continuation of this life, just on another level. Not heaven, not hell, just another version of existence. And in many traditions, everyone goes there, regardless of how good or bad you were in life. Now, people don't just send the dead off and hope for the best. They often try to help them on their journey. For example, food and drink might be buried with the body, guides might be sent along. Sometimes that guide was an animal, and in some cases, it could even be a person. There are records, for example, of the Natchez, where when a powerful leader died, others, including servants or even family members, were sacrificed to accompany them. Now, here's one of the most fascinating ideas. The soul doesn't necessarily live forever. In some traditions, the soul continues to exist in the land of the dead only as long as the person is remembered by the living. So memory keeps you alive. And when people stop remembering you, the soul begins to fade, which is kind of haunting, but also kind of poetic. Now, occasionally you'll hear ideas about reincarnation, like a child resembling a deceased relative, but this isn't a widespread or central belief across most Native American traditions. And unlike some cultures, there isn't usually a big emphasis on ancestor worship either. So, stepping back, death in these traditions isn't about eternal reward or punishment. It's about transition, balance, and staying connected between worlds. And maybe most importantly, it's about remembering. Because in some beliefs, as long as someone remembers you, part of you is still here. Native American religions today. All right. So let's bring this into the present. Once Europeans arrived in the Americas, everything changed. And one of the first things settlers tried to do was convert Native Americans to Christianity. That effort didn't just happen once. It continued for centuries with varying levels of success. And for some groups, conversion meant being expected to completely abandon their traditional beliefs and practices. But that was not the whole story, because not all forms of Christianity were rigid. Some were more flexible, allowing native traditions, customs, and spiritual ideas to remain part of religious life. Over time, something really interesting happened. Instead of one replacing the other, many Native American communities began to blend the two. Today, most Native Americans identify as Christian in some way, but that Christianity often looks very different depending on the community. Some people follow a more traditional European-style Christianity. Others mix Christian beliefs with Native practices, and most fall somewhere in between. So instead of one uniform religion, what you get is something much more fluid and adaptable. And here's the key point. Even among Native Americans who consider themselves devout Christians, traditional beliefs haven't disappeared. You still see strong beliefs in spirits, healing practices, and medicine men and women, even in urban areas. In some places, modern medicine and traditional healing actually work side by side. Doctors and nurses during the day, medicine men and women performing rituals at night. And instead of competing, these systems are often seen as complementary. You also see this blending in religious celebrations. For example, many Native American Christians celebrate holidays like Good Friday and Easter, but they do so using traditional elements like song, dance, and ceremony. Among the Yaqui, for example, Jesus is sometimes associated with the deer because both represent sacrifice for the survival of others. So again, it's not either or, it's both. And this blending goes even further. Some Native Americans incorporate Christian figures like Jesus or the Virgin Mary into their spiritual visions. Others reinterpret Christianity through a Native lens. For example, some traditions see the Christian God as similar to the Great Spirit. There are even groups like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who connect Native Americans to biblical narratives, teaching that they are descendants of ancient peoples of Israel. Now, whether or not people accept those ideas varies widely, but the point is, these interpretations helped make Christianity feel less foreign. At the same time, traditional Native religions haven't disappeared. In fact, in recent decades, there's been a revival. Many Native communities are actually working to reclaim and preserve their traditional beliefs, ceremonies, and cultural identities. And some of these efforts go beyond individual tribes, bringing together shared traditions across different groups. So there's a growing sense of identity that both honors the past and adapts to the present. Now, there's also something else happening. Non-Native interest in Native American spirituality has been increasing, especially among young people drawn to New Age ideas. The Native communities have mixed feelings about that. Some welcome the recognition. Others are concerned that sacred traditions might be misunderstood, misused, or taken out of context because these practices aren't just interesting cultural artifacts, they're living, meaningful systems of belief. And one final note, even today, many sacred objects and rituals are carefully protected. They're not shared freely, and they're often not meant for outsiders because for Native communities, religion isn't just something you observe, it's something you belong to. So when we talk about Native American religions today, we're not talking about something frozen in the past. We're talking about traditions that have adapted, blended, resisted, survived, and are still evolving right now.